It's Tuesday, it's 11:45 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP Mark Harper, SNP Deputy Leader at Westminster Kirsten Oswald, New Statesman Britain Editor Anoush Chakalian and Daily Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Today...
Has number 10 been lying, Mr Zahawi?
More questions over the government's handling of complaints about Chris Pincher.
My overriding priority is to make sure we have a proper process which people can have trust in.
What does this former Chief Whip make of the way it's been handled?
When there's no food, what use is art?
Should protesters have covered up this masterpiece? Will this persuade voters at the next election?
You can have Ed Miliband walking through that door, backed by this coalition of chaos.
Or will it be Jeremy Corbyn at the head of a coalition of chaos?
Should the police show zero tolerance to these petrol protesters? Let's start today's programme with that final headline, the story in that headline, which is about the Go Slow protests on a number of motorways yesterday across the UK. This was the response in the Daily Mail from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. As Day of Action hits motorways and summer of chaos looms, arrest protest mob. She wants to see zero tolerance being exercised, which would include imprisonment and unlimited fines as part of a wealth of new powers that have been given to the police. So, should there be zero tolerance exercised by the police for these kinds of protesters, Mark?
Well, I think the protests yesterday caused a huge amount of inconvenience, and my constituents will have been inconvenienced because there were protests that closed one of the 7 bridges and on the M5. And actually, looking at the reports, I think the police did act. I think there were a number of arrests yesterday from people that were effectively blocking the highway and stopping people going about their lawful business. I'm very in favour of protest, but it shouldn't stop other people going about doing what they need to do and carrying out their normal business.
You're right, 13 protesters were arrested yesterday for driving too slowly, but should they go further? Should they exercise their right, the police, with these new powers to imprison and hand out unlimited fines to protesters?
Well, I think the police have got a wealth of powers. I think in our system, I am content to let the police judge on all the facts what they do, and then we have an independent judicial system to punish people. I think that's much better than members of Parliament or ministers sort of deciding what those punishments should be.
Kirsten Oswald, do you support a zero-tolerance approach?
Actually, reflecting back on what Mark said, it's not, I don't think, reasonable for Mark to say that he supports people's right to protest, because that's not what his government has done in terms of the legislation. So, the way that the UK government deals with protest, I think, is really challenging. People do have rights. That doesn't take away from the challenges that'll cause to the travelling public.
Well,
of course, it
doesn't.
You
support protests like this on the roads? Go slow?
I think people should have the right to protest. Sure. Now, that does not mean that it's not inconvenient to people. It doesn't mean that I am personally about to go out and engage in that protest. But I think we have to be very careful to tread the right line between people's rights in terms of their ability to protest and where the government comes in with a heavy hand. So I don't think that the UK government has got that line right at the moment. And I think the other thing we need to think about is, why are people protesting? Is the UK government doing enough to mitigate the challenges that the Tory cost of living crisis is causing for all of them? And no, the answer to that is absolutely not. So they shouldn't get away from what is behind all of this either. It isn't a straightforward headline that the government should be looking at. It should really be looked at in a much more rounded way.
OK, well, the Home Secretary obviously urging the police to use the new powers that they have been given.
Yeah, well, this is a perfect test case, isn't it, for that Policing Act, which was very controversial because of the provisions in it against protest. That Act was created because of certain disruptive protests like Extinction Rebellion, and then we've had Insulate Britain as well, stopping traffic. So it will be an interesting test case for Priti Patel's legislation. But also, these people are protesting against fuel duty. They want a fuel duty cut. Well, Rishi Sunak cut fuel duty. You know, he announced that just over 3 months ago. In fact, fuel duty hasn't risen since 2010. So I think the UK government has to look at another way of helping these poor people who are clearly in quite a financial predicament.
I mean, fuel duty protests in the past, as you'll remember, Tim, have been quite a potent weapon, if you like, in terms of bringing the country to a standstill and persuading governments to change their mind.
If you're talking about the Blair protests, then I'm far too young to remember that. But yes, I dimly
I'm
recall...
so sorry for that historic reference.
Recall that you're quite right. It was that and the Countryside Alliance were the first two significant anti-Blair protests. On a point of view of philosophical principle, you have a right to protest, you do. But that's balanced against other citizens' rights to not be harassed or to get to their place of work. The police have got to judge that. They've long said we don't have the powers to enforce this. Well, now they've got it, so it's a test case. And Conservatives, I hope, are going to be consistent on this. A lot of Conservative MPs will have some sympathy for this particular group of protesters, but they said there should be that there shouldn't be disruption caused by environmentalist protesters. They've said it about Extinction Rebellion. It should be said about this too, that it's a basic principle. You have a right to protest, but you don't have a right to ruin someone else's life. OK, well, we're going to be talking a little bit more about environmental protests and protesters later on in the programme. But for now, let's talk about the former Deputy Chief Whip, Chris Pincher, who quit his job last week over allegations he groped two men at a private members' club in London. You can see him here on Downing Street. He was also eventually suspended from the Conservative Party. He has apologised. He says he's seeking professional medical support and has denied misconduct. Now, Downing Street initially said that Boris Johnson was not aware of any specific allegations against Mr Pincher when he appointed him Deputy Chief Whip. Well, the picture has completely changed. As you can see from this BBC Story headline, Boris Johnson was made aware of formal Chris Pincher complaint. Well, let's talk to the author of that story, our political correspondent Ione Wells. Ione, tell us exactly how has the picture changed?
Well, it's changed massively, Jo, as you say. Last night we revealed that a formal complaint was made about Chris Pincher when he was a Foreign Office Minister in 2019 and that a formal process was followed, led by Cabinet Office officials into his behaviour. And crucially, while the investigation was led by officials, both the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the then Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab were made aware of this complaint at the time. Now, the complaint ended up in a report confirming his misconduct, and I understand Mr Pincher apologised to those involved at the time for his conduct. Now, why this is really significant, as you say, is the fact that just on Friday, Downing Street was essentially saying the Prime Minister was not aware of any specific past allegations about Mr Pincher's behaviour. They wheeled out some of their own ministers to say exactly that on record. Now, fast forward just a couple of days, Number 10 then said yesterday that actually the Prime Minister had been aware of some allegations, but these were reports and allegations that were either resolved or had not led to a formal complaint. Now, in this case, this Foreign Office complaint case, we know that a formal complaint was made. We know a process was followed. So Number 10 seemed to be hinging on this word resolved. But, you know, this is an interesting sort of line from them, because clearly resolved does not necessarily mean that somebody was cleared. And in this case, we know, in fact, that he accepted the findings of that report.
Ione, there's been a significant intervention today by the former Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office, Lord MacDonald. Tell us about that. We can show also the letter that he's penned.
That's right. This is a really significant intervention. Very uncommon for a sort of former top civil servant to make such a kind of damning public statement like this about members of government. But this was Lord MacDonald, who was formerly head of the diplomatic service, writing to the Standards Commissioner, essentially accusing Number 10 of not telling the truth about this. Now, there's a number of claims that he sets out in his letter. He says that the Prime Minister was personally briefed not only about that investigation that took place in the Foreign Office into this complaint, but also about the outcome of that complaint. And Lord MacDonald has also raised concerns and kind of grievances with Number 10's use of that word resolved, because he says resolve doesn't mean that Chris Pincher was exonerated, and this wasn't a sort of happy ending to the situation. In fact, the opposite. So a pretty damning letter there from Lord MacDonald today. And I think this intervention has sort of certainly added to that feeling of upset among some backbench MPs, but also some ministers as well, who feel like they've been sort of marched up a hill only to be marched back down again. Now, the only response we've had in addition today from the government is from the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, who admits that he and Lord MacDonald spoke to Mr Pincher when he was in the Foreign Office about his conduct. So again, admitting that this process took place, he says it didn't escalate to any sort of formal disciplinary action. But as I say before, that doesn't necessarily mean anything about him being cleared, because if anything, we know that the opposite happened, that he accepted the findings of this report. So I think still big questions outstanding for the Prime Minister as we speak about why he then went on to appoint him to this Deputy Chief Whip role just earlier this year as part of that supposed shake-up to number 10 when he knew about these allegations that were ongoing, particularly as that role is not only responsible for party discipline, but also the welfare of other MPs.
Indeed. BBC political correspondent Ione Wells, thank you very much. Well, let's have a listen to some of what Lord MacDonald said on BBC Radio 4's Today programme.
I think they need to come clean. I think that the language is ambiguous. It's sort of telling the truth and crossing your fingers at the same time and hoping that people are not too forensic in their subsequent questioning. And I think that is not working.
Mark, Lord MacDonald says it's not working. Why not?
Well, look, I think his letter raises some very troubling questions. I read it very carefully. The first thing is that he's very clear that when Mr Pincher was a minister in the Foreign Office, he did things which were similar to what he was accused of doing at the Carlton Club, and officials complained about that behaviour, and the complaint was upheld. So in other words, he did do those things. Now, the first question that leaps into my mind is why the Prime Minister felt it appropriate for him to remain a Minister of the Crown. It seems to me that that sort of behaviour should mean that you were dismissed. The second question is, given the Prime Minister knew that, why he made him Deputy Chief Whip. For those of your listeners, your viewers that don't know, the Deputy Chief Whip is traditionally responsible for the pastoral care and the welfare of my parliamentary colleagues, and is also the first point of call when people have a complaint to make about the behaviour of an MP. And the fact that with that record, which the Prime Minister, I understand, was personally briefed about, that's what
Lord MacDonald said.
He said the person in the Cabinet Office who helped undertake the investigation personally briefed the Prime Minister. Why he was put into the position of Deputy Chief Whip, it seems to me it shows a complete indifference to the welfare and safety of my parliamentary colleagues, and I think they will reflect on that over the coming days about how much the Prime Minister thinks about them. The final point, which you touched on there, is it does appear that ministers of the Crown have been lied to by people in Downing Street before being sent out onto the media. I heard a very excellent colleague of mine, Will Quince, yesterday, who said that he'd received categorical assurances that the Prime Minister was not aware of any specific allegations. Now, it appears that what he was told wasn't true. And I think that raises some very serious questions about the conduct of Downing Street. Downing Street's supposed to have been reorganised. When we had the vote of confidence, and I'll be clear, I voted against the Prime Minister, but he won, and I felt he should be given time to learn from that process. The weeks since haven't demonstrated a great deal of change, and I don't think things are working, and I think he's got some very serious questions to answer in the days to come.
And you very much see this as Boris Johnson's personal responsibility. I mean, you seem quite upset about it, Mark.
Well, he appoints people to the government, and he is ultimately responsible for their conduct. And reading Lord MacDonald's letter this morning, I don't understand how the Prime Minister could have felt it was appropriate to leave Mr Pincher as a minister, leading a government department, being in a leadership position, when a serious complaint about, let's be frank, it would be about, if the allegations are similar to those,
about the allegations of groping.
It would be about assault. I don't understand how that complaint could have been upheld and the Prime Minister felt it was appropriate for a minister to remain in office. And I will be very interested to hear the answer to that question, because I simply don't understand how it can be true. And I am quite upset. I was responsible, when I was Chief Whip, for my colleagues in Parliament, and I took those responsibilities seriously. And I think the Prime Minister has some serious questions to answer.
Chris Pincher has denied the allegations, but you're quite right. There was actually an inquiry and investigation separately, which was upheld, as you say, historically. What can you and others do? You mentioned Will Quince, the minister that was on the airwaves yesterday and in front of the TV cameras. We can show you pictures of today's cabinet meetings, and I think you can probably all deduce from the scenes that it's pretty grim-faced, because, you know, day after day, Therese Coffey was first actually on Sunday, you can see her there, ministers are being asked to defend a position given to them by Number 10 and the press office. Where does that leave these people that we're looking at now and ministers going out to defend the government?
Well, I think, frankly, it's very interesting looking at those expressions and faces this morning. Every person sat in that room has a responsibility to think about what's happened and decide what they should do about it. We have cabinet government in this country, and they're all responsible for what goes on. They're not responsible for the Prime Minister's behaviour, but they are responsible if they choose to do nothing about it.
Any conversations with any of those cabinet ministers?
Look, I've made my position very clear. I didn't do it behind the scenes. I told the Prime Minister to his face what I thought about his conduct over Partygate, which does bear some similarities to this. And I told him I felt he wasn't worthy of the office of Prime Minister, and I haven't changed my opinion.
Tim, how serious is Lord Macdonald's intervention? You've heard what Mark Harper thinks very clearly and is upset about the whole situation. A senior civil servant, deeply unhappy with Boris Johnson and how this whole saga has been handled, or is it much more fundamental than that?
I thought the cabinet meeting looked like a staff meeting on the Titanic. It looked absolutely awful. The problem is that the Number 10's line keeps changing, and each time it changes, a new lie is exposed. So the initial line was, Prime Minister knew nothing. Then it turned out he did know something. Then the line being spun last night, which I think they would have gone with today, was, and I think a not unreasonable line, that we don't operate on the basis of rumour, and each man must be given a fair hearing and a fair trial. The problem is that we now know it's not rumour, because he was found to have done something. Dominic Raab today said, please don't use the guilty word. For some reason, he thinks this is an important distinction. But a complaint against him was upheld. Now, the problem is with all of this that, first of all, as you've said, you're sending ministers out to lie on your behalf, which puts them in a very difficult position because it means, not to lie on your behalf, but to repeat a falsehood on your behalf. It is Number 10 which appears to have lied. It is the ministers with them being required to repeat it. It means they're not going to trust Number 10. Politically, why should they do anything for this operation if they can't rely upon what it having said being accurate, and they can't rely that they won't be embarrassed by it the next day? But also, it just comes after a lot of other stuff, and it gives the impression of an anarchic and chaotic Number 10, in which people are appointed not on the basis necessarily of talent or moral character, but because they are staunchly loyal to a Prime Minister who is perpetually in trouble and needs friends. Right,
we did ask, unsurprisingly, Number 10, if we could speak to a minister, but none was available. Make of that what you will. There is also a sense, though, Anoush, which we discussed yesterday on the programme, that outside Westminster, is this a big issue, this particular set of events involving Chris Pincher and the government? What do you think people make of it?
Well, I was out on the road reporting, speaking to people ahead of both the local elections this year and the two by-elections that we've just had. So I was speaking to a lot of people about their impressions of this government. And of course, this was before this story had broken. But there was a sense that there was a general chaos, Tim used the word chaos, around the government. And the fact that there was sort of a decline in trust and questions over the moral character of the people who are governing this country. So I think, if people are tuning into this story, I don't know whether they would be specifically, but I think this will add to that impression, which is incredibly damaging for all politicians. I'm sure Kirsten's not very happy about how what light it casts all politicians in, because that's something that came up on the doorstep as well. Sort of, they're all as bad as each other and we can't trust them. So I think Boris Johnson has done a lot to degrade that confidence in our politicians. And of course, we've seen this happen before with the Partygate scandal. People were sent out to defend lines that turned out not to be true. There was so much back and forth, who knew what when. They didn't learn those lessons, even though Number 10 was supposed to be reformed after that.
Right, Kirsten, I'm presuming that you agree broadly with the thrust of what you've heard, because I want to turn to a different story, and that involves Patrick Grady, because the BBC News have reported the police are dropping probe into Patrick Grady harassment allegations. This was allegations of sexual harassment against Glasgow MP Patrick Grady. He stood away from the SNP membership after newspapers reported officers would be examining claims against him, but now we know that that is not going to happen. Now, you're Deputy Westminster Leader of the SNP. Should Patrick Grady now get the SNP whip restored?
I think it's probably a little bit premature for me to say that. I think that there would have to be a process that was gone through to examine that. I think that we probably, given all the conversations that we've just had, which I think have been correct, we need to be reflective about these things. It's I think a sad situation and a really challenging situation, and I certainly am not going to take away from that. So I'm not aware of what his intentions are actually, and also, although I've read the headlines, I'm not aware of the Met's
But if he wants to,
verdict.
He stood away because he thought the police would investigate. Now they're not. One might assume that he would want to come back into the fold.
There would have to be a proper process that was gone through to
and what would that look like, Kirsten?
Well, I think that there would have to be very serious conversations about what situation we're in, how we got there. And I think that what has to underlie all of that, and this came through actually very strongly in what Mark said as well, is that there are human beings who are affected by all of these stories. So that reflection, I think we've said we would look further by means of a review of making sure that that there is proper supportive processes there. I think that really matters. I welcome what the Speaker has said in terms of the Speakers' Conference looking at that.
Yeah.
I think all of that is probably something that should occupy our minds quite seriously. And, I appreciate, headlines are there in newspapers about these things, but we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about all of this.
Right. When you say thoughtful about all of it, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, your leader, said actually that your group, the SNP's Westminster group, had questions to answer over its handling of the harassment complaint against Mr Grady, because the implication was you didn't actually support the victim enough. Do you accept that?
And that's exactly what we're going to look at, because, I think
you do accept that?
Well, that's why we'll look at it. So, I think that if we're not willing to look and determine, what might we do differently, were there things that we could have done better, then I think that we're letting everybody down, actually. So, one of the things that Anoosh said about, people expecting to look at politics and politicians and have a degree of confidence that people will try and do the right thing, I think that is what needs to underlie what we do and where we go forward from here.
You're looking sceptical, Tim.
You say there's got to be a process. Well, Chris Pincher went through a process, and he came out of it at the other end with another job. And I think the question of what do people think about this outside of Westminster, I think the thing they think is, give everyone a fair hearing. But in my profession, if I was accused of the various things that several different characters in Parliament have been accused of, it wouldn't be a case of I'll just resign for a bit, I'll think about my seat, I'll have a process and a thought and a discussion and a reflection. In most professions, you'd just be sacked. And in politics, partly because it still is constitutionally an amateur sport, there is no culture of compliance. There is no automatic, you've done this, so you're out. And maybe there shouldn't be, because constituents should ultimately decide who stays and goes.
Just to be clear, the Independent Complaints and Grievance system, which is there in place in Parliament, is there to look at these kind of really difficult issues which people may unfortunately have faced. And we've absolutely accepted the findings of their recommendations. And, I think that there is an independent process there. I'm not sure that fully deals with all of the points you're making, so that's why I think we do need to reflect.
Because, and sorry, I hate to be really technical, but
there's
a big debate in Parliament at the moment about the nature of the ministerial code. Basically, when it comes to government employment, it's the Prime Minister who decides. And a member of the government could have done appalling things, but the final person who decides if they stays or goes is the Prime Minister.
And that, I agree with you, is a real challenge, given all of the things the Prime Minister has said and done, that we know to be completely false.
Right, Anoosh, and on this point about having a process that does have some sort of teeth and that people can believe in, if, as Tim said, you can get another job at the end of it, or even be promoted or whatever it is, people will just think it's a farce.
Yes, it's bizarre. It doesn't chime with how other people's jobs work, as you put it. I mean, the problem is in politics, and it's not a rare thing to promote someone for loyalty rather than for moral integrity or for competence, but that's what happened with Chris Pincher. The Prime Minister had to appoint him as Deputy Chief Whip because he'd been central to shoring up his position position earlier on this year. He was in the shadow whipping operation. So, you know, that's why he got that position of influence, despite what we now know, or we now are being told the Prime Minister already knew about him.
Teachers and caregivers can be suspended for months unfairly on the basis of an accusation that proves out to be inaccurate. The Prime Minister gets a fine and he stays in place. It's a different system.
There's two things on this. Look, yesterday the Prime Minister's official spokesman said that the Prime Minister, when he appointed Mr Pincher to be Deputy Chief Whip, had to balance his skills, quote marks, and these allegations. Now, I'm sorry. Yes, but of course we now know that wasn't true because the Prime Minister knew about it. Now, in my book, you don't do that. There are certain things where you just don't give someone a job as a Minister of the Crown responsible for the welfare of your colleagues if they've behaved in a certain way. The second thing is, and I'm pleased that Lord MacDonald referred to this in his letter, we do need to think about the victims here. Now, I'm not going to talk about the things that Chris Pincher, the latest complaint. There's a proper process and it's important that that's done properly and a proper report will be produced. And if he's found to have done those things, there will be sanctions recommended and then they will be looked at by Parliament. And we do now have the power to have tough sanctions which can lead, if the offence is serious enough, to the recall of a Member of Parliament and them leaving Parliament, which is up to their constituents. But I'm not going to talk about that. But it's important we remember there are victims here, and the duty that we all have is not just to the victims that have already existed, but we have the duty to protect vulnerable people so there aren't any more victims. And if you put someone who you know a complaint was upheld against into a powerful position, you are potentially creating more victims, and that is something I think we all need to reflect on.
Let's talk about this story in The Times. English Attorney General, that's Suella Braverman, has no right to target Scottish gender bill. Attorney General may try to block trans self-identification law. This is about Suella Braverman saying there are serious implications of what the Scottish Government is proposing, and that is allowing all trans people over the age of 16 to change their official gender without a medical diagnosis and having lived in their chosen gender for just 3 months. That is in contrast to the existing rules by the UK Government. They did look at this, but in 2020 they decided not to go ahead with self-identification, I should say, and they must provide a panel with evidence of a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, as well as proof that they have been living in their chosen gender for at least 2 years. They must also be at least 18. Kirsten, what do you make of Suella Braverman's move?
Well, actually, it's a bit perplexing because, you know, she can make that statement if she wants. Obviously, she has done, but it's not up to her. You know, this is a matter for the Scottish Government. Quite properly, the Scottish Government has decided their course of action and they're pursuing that. So I'm not quite sure why she thinks that she has an in to make any change or why she thinks that would be appropriate in any way. I do also, you know, slightly wonder about some of the comments that are attributed to her. You know, she thinks that it will cause all manner of confusion, and I'm sorry, I don't agree with that at all. We have a different legal system in Scotland. We have a different educational system. You know, they're all different kinds of sporting bodies. None of these things cause any problems whatsoever. I have no clue why she would think that this particularly would cause a problem. And, you know, what does she propose to do with people that have perhaps come over from Ireland, for instance? You know, how is she going to deal with them differently? Is she going to take that up with the Irish Government? It doesn't really bear a lot of scrutiny. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm a bit baffled because I don't think that there's a sensible road for her to travel down there, nor should she.
Right. Is it a problem having 2 different rules?
Well, I think potentially it could be because there are things. Well, there are things that are done at a UK level where this would be relevant. And personally, I think there are certain things where it's better if you do them on an all UK basis. And I understand
that's not the constitutional arrangement that exists.
No, I get that. So I get the Scottish Government has. I understand it. If it's devolved, they can do it. I do think, though, there are certain things it's better if you can have a consistent position across the UK. And my understanding is that UK ministers are talking to their Scottish Government counterparts, and if they can come to some agreement about that, I think that would be preferable. But ultimately, I believe the legal position is that the Scottish Parliament can legislate on this.
It's always sensible to have dialogue. But Nobody would argue with that.
But I do think if you can have a consistent position, I think that would be helpful. So in that sense, I agree with the sort of thrust of that position.
Right, with Bernard Jenkin, the Conservative MP who chairs the Westminster Liaison Committee, said the proposed bill, your proposed bill, would breach the devolution settlement because it intends to endow new controversial rights on all UK citizens which have not been approved by this Parliament, enabling anyone from any part of the UK to acquire a GRC, that's a gender recognition certificate in Scotland, and gain access to women-only safe spaces.
There are plenty of very sensible arrangements to make sure that women are protected, as we should expect to be, and I think that Bernard Jenkin is really off down the wrong road there. So it is absolutely legitimate for people to enter into dialogue, as Mark said. I think that's actually quite welcome. A little bit more by way of constructive dialogue would be really welcome on these kind of topic, but I don't think that that kind of statement from Bernard Jenkin actually goes there. So yes, let's have constructive dialogue. Let's also accept that the Scottish Government has the power to do what they are intending to, and that in itself follows lots of constructive dialogue. And as we go forward, let's try and encourage more of that and a little bit less of the heat that I'm reading into both of these comments that you have quoted.
Is there a compromise here? Is there a compromise between these two quite different standpoints in terms of the law?
I don't know, but what I would say is this debate has absolutely nothing to do with constitutionality or devolution. It's a debate about trans rights, which the government is trying to put the brakes on. It's as simple as that. It's a political matter. The thing about the Conservatives is they have a habit of endorsing a principle and then rowing back on the practice. So if they'd said 5 or 6 years ago, look, we believe that individuals should be able to do whatever they want, but we're not 100% on board with the idea of trans is a human right. Okay, if they'd laid out that socially conservative position a few years ago, that'd been fine. But instead they said trans rights are human rights. And then a whole load of things developed as a result of that. The issues around access to restrooms, the issues around trans people in sports, etc. So the government, having signed up to one position, then has to put the brakes on or row back on lots of other things. And it finds itself putting out fires here and there about, can you self-identify? Can you play in sports? So the government, having accepted the principle of trans rights are human rights, now finds itself in the difficult position of trying to push back against the obvious implications of that, such as why, if someone self-identifies as a woman, if the philosophical argument is that, in fact, they were a woman from birth, they happen to have a different body, but they were a woman from birth, why shouldn't they be able to self-identify? Why would you put them through the humiliating step of saying they've got to prove who they are? Why should they have to go before a medical panel to say... None of this makes any sense if you accept that trans rights are human rights, which the government has done. So it's now trying to fight back on things that it has conceded.
And do you accept that? I mean, do you accept the government's position? It's sort of gone through its various stages and has settled on this current position, which, as you quite rightly say, if you want to get a certificate recognising a change in gender as a trans person and you haven't had surgery or any of the other stages you have to go through, a medical panel example, then you can't.
Yeah, I think the government should have thought about this 4 or 5 years ago when the issue came up. But Conservatives, either because the party contains a large number of social liberals or, more overwhelmingly, because they're terrified of the nasty party label, refused to engage with this very complex philosophical issue and stake out a clear, consistent position from the beginning.
Well, I think you've laid out well the journey that the government has been on this, but you said that it was in a difficult position. I don't think it's necessarily a difficult position to bring up these rows, a potential constitutional crisis over this particular subject. You know that they like to whip up opposition on this. You talked about heat in the debate, and I just think that's exactly what this is, not least because the SNP and the wider independence movement has had a lot of very tense divisions over trans rights in general, which we saw particularly last year along factional lines. It was weaponised in the feud between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. So we know that this can become very political very quickly, and I do think that's probably to this kind of government's advantage.
Right, well, that's clear. What I'm still not clear about for Mark and for Tim is where you actually stand. Do you agree with the UK government's position when it comes to self-identification, or not, as the case may be, or with Kirsten Oswald's position?
Well, I think I'm pretty happy with the government's position to the extent it's clear. But as I said, I think trying to get some discussion between the two governments would be helpful, because I think having two diametrically opposed positions in the UK isn't actually very helpful. But whether we can get there, I don't know.
I'm not sure
I think one of the
that works.
Sorry.
So, yes, just to go back to all of the other things that we have different arrangements for without it causing any challenges at all. And that's absolutely fine. It's absolutely normal. And I'm not quite sure why we would stick this issue on to this particular discussion.
Tim?
I think what the government would say is there are two different, distinct phenomena. There is someone who throughout their life has been on a journey towards changing their gender and take that journey very, very seriously, and they proceed as an adult with medical and psychological help. Then they are concerned that there is a wider cultural phenomenon of particularly younger people deciding that they are a different gender without necessarily going through all the hoops that and all the jumps that everyone else has gone through. And I think the government's trying to put a brake on that. They're saying if you allow self-ID, you just encourage a culture where you have more...
And do you agree with that, Tim?
I'm sympathetic towards that, yes, because I take the journey that trans people have gone on so seriously that I think it should be one which is properly medically and pastorally supported, and not one which is part of a general culture where you just say, I've decided I'm a man or a woman at the age of 14 or 15 without having had a proper conversation with doctors and physicians and psychologists about it.
All right. Let's just take a look at this. This is a picture we can show you here that has been covered up. It's a constable painting, that bucolic scene, the Haywain. Climate protesters have covered it up. They then glued themselves to the frame of the painting. We can talk to Emma Brown from Just Stop Oil. Hello to you, Emma. It's a masterpiece, a treasure of the nation, you might say, that particular painting. Can you understand why many people will be outraged by what you did?
I think we need to look at the bigger picture here. So we're demanding that the UK government stop licensing and consents for the 40 new oil and gas projects that they're proposing to push through this year. We need to be outraged at that. I don't know if you saw the video from the action on the Haywain, but there were a group of 11-year-old school children that were in the gallery at the time, and they were applauding us because we seem to be the only adults that are standing up for their future. And if they get it, why don't you?
We are looking at the video, actually, of the painting being covered up in just the way you've described. Is, though, damaging national art the best way to persuade people? You persuaded that group of school kids, as you said, or certainly they were supporting you. Is it the best way and most effective way to bring people over to your side of the argument?
OK, so first of all, we had a statement from the National Gallery that there was minor damage to the frame and the varnish, which has already been successfully dealt with, so we're not damaging artwork. The UK government are criminally damaging our planet, you know, and civil resistance has shown throughout history, as much as they try and persuade us that it doesn't, it's proven to be the last best hope. And young people are terrified about the future, and they have a perfect right to be. And we are also incredibly angry at the failure of this government. And that's why we're taking any necessary peaceful action that we can to really ram this point home, because we don't have a lot of time and we're in a very serious situation.
All right, Emma, I'm going to ask the panel to respond, so stay with us. Mark, obviously you're not in the government, but what would you like to say to Emma? Do you support this sort of action?
Well, I don't, and I think they're fundamentally mistaken. I mean, the government has a very strong commitment to achieving net zero by 2050. We hosted a successful conference in Glasgow. On the fossil fuel thing specifically, which is what I think they're campaigning against, we're going to be using gas as a transition fuel for the next decade or so. And it seems to me it's much better if we use domestic UK supplies of oil and gas, rather than buying it from dictators like Vladimir Putin, for example, who use the money for their warmongering in Ukraine, or we ship it halfway around the world. So if you're going to use fossil fuels, which we're going to be using for another decade or so, it seems to me much better to get them from the UK continental shelf rather than importing them from dictators around the world. And that's where I think they're fundamentally mistaken, because we are going to be using fossil fuels for the next 10 years.
Emma, do you want to respond to what Mark said?
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. First of all, the UK government, according to their own statistics, we have 8 years left in reserves in the gas and oil fields that we already have. We need to use that to transition. The UN, the International Energy Agency, everyone is saying that we cannot invest in any new oil and gas projects this year. This is also setting out a terrible precedent to the rest of the world that they can continue that. We cannot continue this. And the government's own climate change committee has voiced fears. Last week, there was a damning report that they are having major policy failures, the scant evidence of delivery, and they are willing the ends but not the means. This report showed that present plans will not fulfil the commitment to net zero.
Okay.
So I'm afraid your government minister is lying to us.
Well, he's not a minister, and he's not lying. He's not a minister.
Well, I can't see anyone. I'm on like a Zoom link on a blank
Conservative. He's a Conservative MP. I know you can't see anybody. You're at a disadvantage in that sense, as these panellists know themselves, because they've pinned down the line so many times. Anoush, what did you make of the protest itself when you saw the painting being covered up?
Well, I thought it was a very imaginative protest, and I'd have to say, if I was one of those 11-year-olds on a school trip, that would have been the most exciting school trip to the National Gallery for me. So I think it must have been quite fun. I think these kind of eye-catching, sort of quite outrageous protests can be very effective. I mean, look, we're talking about it on this programme now, for example. But something that I find particularly interesting about Just Stop Oil is that they say that they got their inspiration from those lorry driver protesters back in 2000, which is sort of perhaps an irony, because they might be on sort of both sides of fossil fuel use, for example. But those protests were extremely effective, and the Labour government cut fuel duty the following year, so they can work. Tim?
It's not hard to impress 11-year-olds. They believe in Santa Claus. I mean, I don't know why people keep saying... They were doing all sorts of arguments, and I met some children and they agreed with me. Because they're kids. They don't understand the complexities, and also they don't have to pay the damn bills. The morality is not all on one side. I agree. We've got to move away from fossil fuels. We've got to green the planet. We've got to do this, in particularly for developing nations. But governments also have a responsibility to make sure that people don't shiver and freeze at winter. You have to provide energy. Gas and oil are going to be a transitional fuel. I'm sorry, it's not nice, it's dirty, but we're going to have to do it because you have a responsibility to consumers.
Emma?
That's not good enough. We need to plug into the reality of the situation. In Italy, they've declared the state of emergency because of drought. There's 4 million people that have been displaced by floods in Bangladesh. Thousands of people are being evacuated from their homes in Sydney. The UK is not immune to a global crisis. Yeah. In fact, Mark Harper said, I was listening earlier, we have the duty to protect vulnerable people. We have the duty not to be creating more victims. At the moment, that is exactly what they are doing. This is the first...
So what about people who are choosing between feeding or heating their homes?
That is your own fault. Why have you not insulated homes? Why are you not investing in clean, affordable energy, which is so much cheaper? Investing in new oil and gas, Kwasi Kwarteng has said himself, will not reduce energy bills because it's the private company's profit. That's the truth.
Kirsten?
I think it's really interesting what Emma's saying. Actually, and
the protest itself, the covering up.
Well, I'm glad that the painting is OK, but I think that finding imaginative ways to hook people in is perfectly reasonable. So, it's obviously something you'd want to be very careful about. Not sure I would be going away and doing that particular means of protest myself. But yeah, I've been on climate marches with 11-year-olds. There's nothing wrong with their critical thinking on this. And actually, perhaps we need to take a little bit more of that straightforward thinking that you might get from these groups of younger people, because actually fundamentally we can't go on as we are. The UK government should step up and do their bit in terms of funding just transition. The Scottish government have done that. We cannot carry on as things have been done. And, either we take steps, as these protesters are looking for us to do. Really, we're not taking nearly enough steps. Or we have to deal with the consequences. And that, that's something that we have to be real about.
Well, I suppose the next question is, how far are you and your colleagues, Emma, prepared to go? Because the headline in the Metro paper, we can't show it to you just at the moment, but it says protesters sit on Silverstone track after horror crash at British Grand Prix. Oh, there it is. Others, not you, from Just Stop Oil, invaded the racing track at the Grand Prix on Sunday, not putting your own lives at risk, actually, as well as those racing drivers and stewards. Are you really prepared to risk your own lives for this?
Honestly, Jo, our lives are at risk.
So is that
I don't understand. Well, our lives are at risk, and we're willing to do whatever peaceful protest we can. I mean, the Formula One is dangerous. We saw an accident that was nothing to do with us. No one was hurt in that. People are being hurt right now. And at the moment, we have a small and vanishing window of time to take action. That action is not being taken. Mark Harper has also voted against every piece of climate legislation, including the 2015 legislation.
Well, let him answer. Let him respond.
Let him respond. The standards of insulation in newly built homes from 2015. Emma voted against that.
Emma, let him respond, because you've made that.
I voted in favour of the legal change that we made to make sure we had to get to net zero by 2050. Just because I don't agree with every single idea that somebody puts forward to how to get there doesn't mean I'm against it. I support what we're doing to try and get towards net zero. But Tim's right, you have to do it in a sensible way so you continue making sure people have got the energy they need to keep warm, to power the economy and to deliver net zero, and that's what the government's doing.
All right, we're going to have to stop it there. Emma, thank you very much for joining us today. That's all we have time for, and there was quite a lot. I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. From all of us here, thank you to my guests. Bye-bye.